Hello everyone, today we talk about Transdanubian Dacia after the Roman retreat and the problem of the origin of the birth, let's say, of the Romanian people, and more talking about the earlier part than the latter that entails much broader, not just historical but also anthropological, linguistical, broadly meant cultural perspective that we will not address specifically here. And you know what's the deal? Basically, we have this important amount of Romance speakers in Romania. Romanian is spoken fundamentally by roughly 34 million people in the world, mostly in Romania, of course, also in part of the surrounding lands. Also, there are important communities of Romanians in Western Europe, also in Canada, etc. And as for other populations whose history is not, so massively documented, especially at this point in history. I mean, in its origins, there is a great debate that intertwines with with many other issues, right? It can be political, national, so I would like to stay away of those, because obviously everything I say now, this is probably one of those videos that everybody's going to click on, because every time you make a video on this ethnic issues, there is always a chunk of YouTube users that flock. This may be a strategy to get more views, because that's quite easy. You know, all the videos I made around the Balkanic areas, it's usually attract such interest, and it's most striking for the connection that exists, in fact, between Romanian and specifically Italian, through characteristics that we will see in another video, actually, when talking about the Italic colonists, settlers especially in the Balkans, in the Illyricum, broadly meant, that in fact are to be connected with the origins of the Romanian people, in the sense that, this is the problem, we don't exactly know what's the bulk of the Romanian speaking population that made it happen, up to this day, right? We don't know where they originated. There are basically two main theories. The first one is the Daco-Romanian one. It is to say that Romanians would be descending from essentially the Italic-speaking settlers of Roman Dacia. There's another hypothesis that claims that fundamentally Romanians descend largely, at least, from the or at least Romanian derived as a language, because these are also two distinguished things, and here we should digress enormously also on the process of state building of Romania, the broader international issues, but no, we won't. Then it's said derived from the Romance-speaking population of the Balkans. That, in part, there is this imaginary line that is never, it's also impossible to trace historically, between the Greek-speaking south, right? Obviously, it's the dominating Hellenic mother tongue coming from Hellas, and spreading to the north, places like Macedonia, Thessaly, etc., and the coastlines especially. And then, basically, this Romance-influenced chunk of the Illyricum that was Romanized differently from other European lands, such as, I don't know, you speak of Sardinia, Spain, or France, etc., mostly in a phase where the Italic settlers, rather than properly the Roman stock, had carried out this process of Romanization, with an important consequence, because basically in Romanian, the final S that you find in Spain, in Sardinia, in France, has fallen, like in the Italian vernacular, right? Because basically the countryside took over, right? It wasn't a Romanization passing from the elites and from an earlier stage of Romans that were closer to to Latin, but rather from the Italics, right? And therefore there is this great connection that has apparently invested large parts of the Balkans, so much that we're speaking a Romance language at the time, and that for some movements at this point from the south, right? So across the Danube into Dacia, into Romania, would have at some point that we don't know exactly when to locate, like in late antiquity, early Middle Ages, brought to important numbers of Romance speakers to settle in former Roman Dacia and to spread the Roman mother tongue at the origin of the Romanian specifically. So this, as we were saying at the beginning, this is not a problem that we're dramatically concerned with, also because, scholarly speaking, as far as I understand, there is no solution to this. That is one of those topics that is renowningly, like, nobody knows. As for other Balkan languages, what the actual origins of people's movements, etc., just because they're simply not documented, right? And naturally there are supporters of one of the other hypotheses that, however, do not actually provide with a satisfactory explanation. Today we'll look at one aspect of this, that is to say the observation of late Roman authors about the Transdanubian lands of former Dacia that was evacuated by Aurelian, and about the modalities of these resettlement. There is in fact a huge debate between the two major schools, because one says basically that yes, Aurelian evacuated some people from Roman Dacia and settled them into the south, into Mysia fundamentally, and that is still close though. It's on the other bank of the Danube, right? So not even far from Wallachia, which is properly what eventually from this time onwards, from the Germanic Val, which means foreigner. These other populations would be distinguished from the surroundings, settled by the Goths, the Gepids, etc., because they spoke the foreign language, what the Greek authors at the time call it properly Italon phonese, so properly the Italian language. That's how they called the Latin, or the vernacular at that point, because language was already changing, of the Italic settlers that had historically penetrated the Balkans. And others say, well, no, it's not true. Aurelian didn't evacuate so many of these people, so many of these speakers remain in Romania. As far as I believe, actually, it's a mix of both. I mean, I don't personally see any other demographic, migratory dynamic for which either, the Romanians would be originated, linguistically speaking, by just the transhumance of Balkan interlands, shepherds that eventually resettle at some point there. Surely lots of things went on during the migration era, because the Danube Valley was invested and rose up by an astonishing amount of peoples that naturally pushed the sedentary ones that inhabited those lands far across, mostly towards the mountains. That Romania is fundamentally mostly enclosed into this, in the Carpathian Basin, so it's a well-defended area. So this obviously didn't mean that there was no external penetration, but I'd say that's an area where you would like to entrench, in a sense, to take refuge in a way. But literally, there is no way to tell, right? And there are other dynamics, such as Romanian being spoken north of the Carpathians, in Istria, for example, in other areas that at that point is a later process, right? Romanian language starts being documented from the High Middle Ages, Low Middle Ages, so it's something that we can't track before. And truly, for these areas of Europe that are less documented, there's probably less of a production because of and also important political instability, further destructions. We just don't know, right? These are not lands that you can document in detail like you can document France or Italy, whatever. It's very difficult, right? So also but it's still meaningful because the Romance is there, and it's also very similar to Italian compared to other Romance languages. So the question there is, whatever happened, there is surely a connection between Romanization and such linguistical development. So speaking of this land across the Danube, also we should point out other factors. I mean, obviously these lands were occupied by pre-existing populations, namely the Dacians, that also we don't actually know very well, right? Even to say, well, who were these peoples, right? Because once again, if you speak to any nationalist or anti, kind of other nation theory, they all have their own theories, right? It's like that. So it's like these are delusions, like nobody concretely knows about peoples like the Dacians, the Thracians, the Illyrians. We just have some onomastic that is basically that, and doesn't allow us to go much further to say, okay, what was this language about and how did it survive? And Balkan history is very complicated under that point of view, especially in this frontier area. Consider that also the Balkan hinterland was never quite Romanized as we intend. So it's even more remarkable in the sense that certain areas retained Romance rather than keeping to speak their native tongue in a way. But let's say, speaking of Roman Dacia, there is an important change, right? We speak of the time of the Principatus, so roughly, speaking of the age of Nero or Hadrian. The Roman state had the control of the polis, the Hellenic cities, at the mouths of the Dniester and the Bug. So we're talking about Tyras and Olbia, were important commercial centers on the Black Sea that were expression of that more peripheral, say, Hellenicity that, in fact, in itself still preserves some archaic forms of Hellenic life. Right? These were communities heavily, influenced also by the Thracians, by the Scythians, so that we talk of an hybrid, basically, considered that to the Athenians, already the Boeotians were borderline Greeks. So you can imagine, of course, the Mediterranean was an important connector. So it's not rather a matter of land, but of city proper, because also the actual Hellenic influence in the hinterland was very limited. It was a few tens of kilometers, but for the rest, the hinterland peoples kept living in different ways. In spite also of the sometimes important demographic element that characterizes Hellenic colonization. And there is something more, because, in fact, in the Principatus, the Roman Empire controlled Dacia. This great conquest of Trajan that we have never made a video about, nor about the Dacians, nor about the Dacian wars, nor about Trajan. So we will naturally in the future, hopefully. Dacia had been distinguished into three districts, actually: the Dacia Malvensis, the Dacia Apulensis, and the Dacia Porolicensis, that had received, as usual, the experience of Roman urbanization. Right, all know Colonia Ulpia Traiana, the ancient Sarmizegetusa. Right, it was the Dacian, say, capital. It was an important seat of a very important sanctuary around which the Dacian priesthood and aristocracy revolved. So the Dacian wars were a ferocious business, as you understand. The Romans were initially defeated, then eventually, there were this massive scale invasion, one of the most brutal environments, because Dacia was something a bit more compact, and it was there were factors that had helped, right? The proximity to the Romans, but also to previous times to Macedonia. We know that the Dacian Getic aristocracy was quite wealthy and well connected, also internationally with trade. They had therefore an important power and important cohesion at a territorial level. As we were saying before, even here the Carpathians helped a little bit to define this region properly from a territorial point of view, to defend it also. And it was rich in precious metals. That is basically the Romans, when the Romans invaded it across the Danube. Basically the exception in that regard. In part also because the Romans had to defend Mesia, that was basically the only fertile area along the Danube. So to secure Dacia and to control their, also the the plains that stood respectively east and west between the Black Sea and the upper Danube in Pannonia was important also to counter incursions in the Danube, because from the east, from the Ukrainian steppe, there were all these populations such as the Scythians and the Sarmatians that habitually raided around, eventually this great Roman Dacia was not dramatically Romanized, telling the truth, as far as we understand. First of all, because the Romans controlled it, as we'll see now, for a relatively short time, right? It's not like, I don't know, Gaul was under Rome for half of a millennium. This was basically less than 2 centuries. And already from the first half of the 13th century, the Roman domination, for example, of Olbia had been, had vanished gradually. So those were areas that were increasingly under the pressure at this point of the Germans, of Germanic populations, chiefly the Goths, right? That eventually, that more or less, their western branch, the one also the weaker, that descended from roughly today's Poland to the south, occupied properly the Carpathian base, and then eventually there was this other major Gothic kingdom in the Ukraine that had cleared most of the Sarmatian dominion. We made actually 2 videos about the history of the Goths in that period. Then in the 5th century, as you know, the 4th and 5th century, these areas were being invested by the Huns. So that's why it's so messed up in a way, right? These populations were largely semi-nomadic. There was not much of a production. They didn't write more than much. So because they were different, like here it's difficult to draw comparisons, but I don't know, the Dacians were much more sedentary, and developed in a sense than the early Goths in a way. They were a much more militarized society, and they were essentially invaders and moving them. The Dacians wouldn't really think about that. But especially in 271, Aurelian had evacuated Dacia, properly in front of the Goths, because he had deemed that it was basically useless to defend. In terms of cost-benefit ratio, it was better to leave it on its own. So, together with the eagles of Rome, was also Romanity disappeared in the great region conquered by Trajan. This is the deal. So, as we were saying at the beginning, this is a huge question that is debated among scholars, right? And the capital fact is today's presence of the Neo-Latin / Romance Romanian language, right? So properly language of Rome, right? You know that in the Middle Ages, eventually the Romanians began to call themselves properly the Romans, right? And this is naturally, you have to think, the proximity also of the Byzantine Empire, so that there is a big deal there we can't properly see. We don't know what happened before. This is being explained, as we were saying before, as a sort of reinvestment of Romance elements north of the Danube, others with the continuity of Neo-Latin communities of Roman Dacia. And it's an unsolvable question, right? At this point, we have literally no idea. And I personally, I might state that I'm not an expert, so if somebody provides me with actual, scholarly data, but serious one, not the kind of the pastiche of things pasted and copied from the internet or from obscure, so-called scholars. No, I'm talking about scientific community altogether, what it says about this. And, as far as we're reading also from Cambridge publications, the matter is we don't know, and frankly, as a medievalist, I'm not surprised at all of this. But I'm also positive that some histories have to be rewritten, right? I'm not a revisionist in the sense that revising is fine, but for the sake of it, it's not. Like all things that end in ism. But I as a medievalist, I wouldn't be surprised either if we had gotten wrong important chunks of this times and places, right? For the simple reason that local historiographies still have to, to properly develop in a more comprehensive and solid form. That is not easy, right? In countries like, I don't know, that emerged 30 years ago from communism, that had all the strains, the problems of the lack of a state initially, the problem of also foreign dominations. I'm talking a bit all around. So it's obvious, as I was saying before, that it's not just, unfortunately, a matter of local historiography, but also the surrounding ones that pressure it sometimes not in the right direction with the right motivation. I've met somebody from certain areas, but not Romania actually, but have an idea of more or less what's the temper that surrounds these problems. Because as most of this happens for any undocumented historical background, usually there is nothing left but sometimes ideological theories. Because what's the if you simply don't know, you're not left but with speculations. At that point you can think whatever you like, right? This happens in other fields of history that in fact I usually don't like I don't know, if you look at prehistoric warfare, people, it's pure ideology there. It's not really proper becoming a history. Naturally here there is much more to discuss, but yet not much to demonstrate either. One can have an idea. I personally don't know how the problem could be improved in a way. Surely a comprehensive diachronic perspective of the history of all the surrounding countries would be important, right? And I don't know how easy it is to find such an expertise. Probably there are scholars that are truly very, very close to these issues, but sometimes it's also a matter of there is not, for example, it seems to me, a lot of international interest towards these topics, right? It always sounds as if nobody really cared, right? Because it's just those countries that do not that are always just quarreling about such things. Well, I don't think it's a wise approach to the question either. But I would like to hear the opinion, for example, of a Romanian or whatever about this, because it's also sometimes a matter of perception, and there are still stories to be told about properly the history of such perceptions, which are sometimes much more enlightening than what cannot be found through the sources. So there are two fundamental texts of the times that are Eutropius and the Historia Augusta, that speak specifically of a total evacuation of Transdanubian Dacia carried out by Aurelian. Now, modern historiography has kind of a critical attitude relatively to everything that is not is ancient text, right? And or narrative sources in general, and it's natural and even justifiable in a way that we can infinitely discuss on the information given by Eutropius that Aurelian, quote, had the Romans, both from the cities and the countryside, evacuated from Dacia, right, and settled in the midst of Mesia. So the phrase is literally abductos Romanos ex urbibus et agris Daciae in media Mesia collocavit. So it's natural, for example, that the supporters of the continuity, let's call it in this way, suppose that the population of that that was deported in his was only the one from the Dacian cities, right? The Roman cities of Dacia. While the deniers stress the fact that the source explicitly says that these people were resettled from the cities and the countrysides, right? Ex urbibus et agris, as Eutropius wrote. But the doubts fall, in a sense, at least from a purely narrow, if we stick to these sources, if we read the relation of a Roman ambassador to Attila in 448, that is the historian Priscus, that says something very interesting, because he went there. You know that the Hunnic Empire at that point was settled largely around the Pannonian Plain and encompassed the Carpathian Basin, and more or less, I mean, the Huns had come from the east, so there was this broader domination in the surroundings in these areas that, as you can imagine, were, I mean, before the arrival of the Romans, the Dacians didn't properly have, a civilization like the ones of the Greeks or the Romans. They had some fortified centers or some important stage of development, etc. Then the Romans arrived, built this kind of state, all urbanized, connected with roads, aqueducts, etc. Then it's a real province. Then eventually this place is abandoned to itself. It's invested by all these people. So you have to always imagine the collapse of a system that is historically like one of the most messed up things that you can ever imagine. Like literally, and the whole area kept being largely so, in a sense, for centuries to come, right? So you can easily see how this happens even in modern times. Countries that are invaded, independently or not from the fact that we're ruled by dictatorships or whatever, but every time a state collapses and nobody rebuilds it, it's a total mess, right? There is a collapse of public authority, private power rising, and definitely somebody else trying to become the authority there, but still the collapse is something you can't recover from structurally immediately, right? As if nothing happened. So imagine in these areas, like in late antiquity, what the hell might have happened, right? In a frontier situation between the empire, Central Europe, these peoples migrating and investing in the empire, etc. Campaigns back and forth, also across the Danube, as punitive expeditions with destructions of communities, of the plantations, etc. These waves of nomads from the steppes, right? The Carpathians are just in between all of this. So whatever happened was so messed up that we cannot hope even remotely to realize what concretely was going on. I mean, we can't picture the disorder, but not quite tracking more dynamics than this. Also, for the same Romans, Dacia was a secondary, let's say, concern. As we've seen, it was properly abandoned, like would happen with Britain, for example. So, speaking of Priscus' witness, well, this historian was a very accurate observer of the external world to the empire that in late antiquity came back as an object of learning because of the new forced relations that the Romans had to establish with these peoples who were enemies and a threat, but they also could be contained. So there is a renewed, say, ethnological interest, we could say. And Priscus refers, in fact, his precise impressions on the life that existed across the Danube in the region of the rivers Tifesas, Tigas, and Drekon. So here there is a world that, from Priscus' account, is pictured as clearly counterposed to the Roman one. Right? This may be a historiographical topos. We'll see. It may be, in part so, but it's both things at the same time. So the impression we get is clearly that this was something different from what was by Romans perceived at the time. Because Priscus wrote, from the villages they brought us supplies. And in the place of corn, millet. In the place of wine, what in the local language is called the medos, that's basically mead. it's a word that actually is to be found also basically in the Germanic languages. For example, in Old High German, Kamis would be a barley drink, right? So it was therefore a different world, right? Difference between corn and millet from wine and barley drinks. It's a bit like today. There is the difference between the rye bread and the wheat bread world, right? But the typical fact is that for the ambassadors of the Roman Empire, you couldn't find in these lands wine or wheat bread, right? And because if there had been a way, they would have surely obtained it. And in Priscus' account, there is more, because there is a passage that shows properly the barbarization of Transdanubian Dacia. And because Priscus meets a guy that greets him in Greek, and Priscus is surprised because, quote, that a Scythian, literally, the generic term is Skytai, speaks Greek, right? And Skytai here in the Roman, at this point, the Greek ethnographic vocabulary is actually the inhabitant of Dacia, Transdanubian Dacia, and especially the Goths, right? So it's not the Scythians of classical times, but the Romans called them basically these Goths that had surely mixed with, the remains of the Scythians, especially of the Sarmatians, so these Iranian populations that dwelt in the Eurasian steppes at the time, but that now, I mean, the Scythian was, especially for the Greeks, the prototype of the barbarian. Like, those cultures were kind of upside down because they were nomadic. They had, women that fought, all these things. So they were a bit the bizarre stereotype that here becomes an ethnonymic topos, right? For whoever inhabited those lands around there, right? And Priscus says more, because he precises the reasons of such surprise. He says, because the inhabitants of this country, besides their barbarian language, speak the language of the Huns or of the Goths, or also the Italian, the Italic one, the Italon / also Ausonion, sometimes in Greek sources, phone, right? Those amongst them that we have that have frequent contacts with the Romans. So this is interesting. So because here with the Romans, Priscus means with the citizens of the Roman Empire. Therefore, what the passage actually means is that there was properly not Romanity across the Danube. Because if across the Danube there had been somebody that had spoken Latin at that point, so what he says Italian, like in the source, Priscus would have explained that in the region of the rivers Tigris, and Draken, only those who had epimeixia, so that is properly the contacts with the Romans, had remained across the Danube. Right, so what he's saying properly is that these guys, some of them, let's say, they spoke the language of the Huns or the Goths, right? But some also understand Latin because they have frequent contacts with the Romans, right? But they do not speak Greek, except the prisoners of Thracian or Macedonian origin. This is what the same source says at one point, and there is no doubt thus that the indigenous language of which had been Thracian's Dacia was not Latin anymore, right? It was a barbarian language of these millet eaters and meadows drinkers. So the Latin, the language of the Italics, so as it's called from the Greek perspective, which even was not here, it would be properly, translatable literally as the language of the Italians proper, because from the Greek mindset, Italy was a thing on its own. They didn't really look at the difference between, I don't know, the Latins or the Oscans. And we know, as we were saying before, that actually this language of the Italians was properly the one of the Italics, right? Not much of the Latin word, because they had already, and we will make a video about this, that the stereotype of the Roman settler in these areas is somebody who couldn't even speak Latin straight because it was Italic. Not like also the Latins were Italic, but I mean it was Oscan, were not part of the Latin branch. They didn't speak Latin well, right? So amongst these peoples that Priscus found north of the Danube, Latin was spoken only among those that were at contact with the Roman bank, and not properly as an indigenous language, but as a foreign one. This could leave some room to the fact that, yes, so you see there was some contact, and that the language, I mean, that properly Latin was spoken on the right bank of the Danube at the time, or at least this Romance language, let's call it this at this point, and therefore, historically, it's plausible that the contacts would bring to a permanence in this on the left bank of some Romance elements, and maybe some later migrations. Yes, right. I mean, the thing must have happened some way. And personally, I think it's actually both theses that explain what happened at the end. Priscus, however, is precise in this. It might have been a bit elitistic, like saying his account matches with what Eutropius wrote, according to to whom Aurelian had evacuated the Romans from Transdanubian Dacia, not just in the cities and the countryside, right? At least Aurelian, there was the great restorer of the world, right, that had brought the empire together back into one piece after it had basically split in three, and that could collapse, had decided that the Romans could do without Dacia because it wasn't properly even so Roman, right? So that's also another factor you have to consider. How Roman, how Latin Dacia was after 170 years of Roman rule, right? This is an important question to answer because it's not so clear, it's not so obvious to answer here. We should see more, that is properly the process of colonization of Dacia. We'll see at some point, but generally speaking, it wasn't one of the most Romanized lands of the empire, provinces of the empire. Aurelian had properly shifted, though, Dacia from the left to the right bank of the Danube administratively, because he had created a new Dacia that was the Ripensis and the Mediterranean one. So he had replicated the name of the province on the right bank of the Danube with properly how the province would be known at that point. So that also speaks naturally for a Roman element, a Romance-speaking element. It was settled just across the Danube, so not that far either, right? And therefore, this, in my opinion, doesn't quite sound so categorical for one, let's say, one position or another, right? It may be that Priscus wanted also to stress the fact that, those people are just barbarians, they're not Romans anymore. This is a typical elitistic attitude that is also proper of at this point, the Hellenic kind of, more Atlantic, the Eastern Roman Empire in this context. And that may not actually, correspond, or at least not exactly depict in detail what reality was. Because let's think about it. Also the food, right, the drink. Yes, it's indicative of a culture that is definitely a different one. But how was Dacia different, for example, already from when it was conquered by Trajan? compared to what also? Because what's Roman here? In the 5th century, being a Roman in something, cultural, at least ethnically, it has some distinctions from the times of Trajan, right? And also compared to which lands, right? To Constantinople as the myth, let's say the symbological, the ideological center. It was universally created, or to, I don't know, other areas that were considered properly Roman within the same empire, because the Danubian area was notoriously, less Romanized than others, right? Still, at this point, it would be ever more increasingly so, and still within the same empire, those were essentially also the Roman-speaking lands that tell us that at least, maybe in these least populated areas, the Roman colonization had been, at least here it's difficult to go by approximation like this, because Mysia, for example, was very fertile, were important cities there, but they would start declining this time, because they were too exposed then with the fall of the same Dacia to raids, etc. But still, it's remarkable that those areas that didn't speak Latin, Romance languages before, throughout Roman domination in the centuries, had began to receive Romance as a, properly as an influence, as a consistent influence locally, and to have such large amount of people that were actually speaking Romance, like in Gaul. After all, it happened in other areas. Think about Gaul, think about Spain. Those weren't areas that spoke Latin before. Now they do. They speak a Romance language. How did it happen? Well, Romanization was effective, indeed. So it's a bit complicated, really, but it does explain, in part, the matter, right? So the other hypothesis that the Romanians would be akin, for example, to the Aromanians that would be to be found still disseminated in the Balkan Peninsula up to Macedonia and Thessaly, as they're, let's say, akin linguistically speaking, there is possible. But it probably doesn't say it all, right? They can be the Romanized population fled from their seats in south of the Danube after the barbarian invasions. Like certain areas, especially in the Illyrian provinces, could be, I don't know, think about when the Longobards invaded. Because they reached far south, the Gepids, the Hungars, the Slavs, eventually, in the High Middle Ages. We can't really track that. This is the problem. But they would be basically peasants, right? Tied to the land. The Vlachs that brought together with their ethnic Roman in their identity, that would become also a synonym of peasant, right? Because those were areas that, as we've seen many times, were typically, in the Roman world, were controlled by these senators who had huge estates. Most people would be servants / colonists to work the land. Right, so the Vlach is not just somebody who speaks another language from the Germanic perspective, but it's properly somebody different from a social point of view. Right. Also in relation, of course, to the fact the new conquerors usually, as soon as they arrived, saw these people as their own prey, and therefore they didn't enjoy the same rights, especially in areas like these where Romanization might have been, was less than areas like in Western Europe, right? Because especially the Illyricum was actually a very tough land. That by the 3rd century, still while the Illyrian emperors and Illyrian soldiers, well, because those were kind of the least areas to Romanize. And because they had resisted, let's say, the need to the benefits of Romanization, like other peoples had instead gradually accepted and participated. So they were the last ones to present. People were poor enough, desperate enough, warlike enough to join the military as an opportunity, right? There are, for example, here is. Unleash a hornet nest. There are some Albanian borrowings in the Romanian language that probably also there are connections also with the same Romanian that probably speak of some links with at least the area of the Illyrica, because you know also that the origins of the Albanian language are all but actually clear, nor we can't even practically track them, trace them concretely up to very late in time. So the thing that remains here is what properly Priscus said, Italon phone, right, the language of the Italics. That surely, as we were saying also at the beginning, kind of correspond linguistically to the Neo-Latin phenomenon in Italy, right? Because in Italy, Italians have preserved the let's say what the majority of the people, that is the Italics, spoke like, not like the Romans actually did at the beginning, the Latins did at the beginning, and this is to be found also in Romanian. And the connections here are striking, right? And definitely speak of a process that gets even more controversial, because you see, while Western Europe speaks Romance languages because of essentially probably an earlier colonization, therefore a greater closeness to the Roman, not to the Roman language to core, because of course the closest language to Latin today are properly Italian, eventually follows French, and I'm speaking properly from a linguistical point of view, because if we were to stress the phonetic aspect, the closest language to Latin is Sardinian, but linguistically it's not, right? It just sounds like more like it could sound Roman. Then the second is Italian, then it follows Spanish, if I'm not wrong, but properly. So these connections are also to be always reevaluated in the sense of how they eventually language evolved over time. That is not just a vernacular phenomenon, right? Think about, I don't know, Italian that is basically Florentine today. It's like German is Bavarian. Like it's there are too many certifications that you can't simply trace so easily connections with looking at other aspects at the time, right? We know, after all, a few. Like we don't know exactly how the Romans spoke, right? Because Cicero could write in a way, and we would think but that was the elite. What did the average shoemaker of the Subura speak like, or even write like? But well, that we will never know, or at least we have some idea. But the information is so scattered, we have no idea. But so we are dealing here with literally relics of languages of peoples that are extremely difficult to understand, especially in an area like the Romanian one, the Balkan one, and that generally speaking are so underdocumented, right? And there's not really much we can do about it, but it's still meaningful that the Italic connection is to be found, and still, as we were saying, it's more controversial that this process probably happened later than it happened in Western Europe. So in moments in which, in theory, the strength of Romanization had kind of decreased. So I believe it's possible that certain regions like the Balkan ones, I'm talking about the interland, not the Greek south that kept speaking Greek and didn't give a damn, basically, about the rest. But those areas, you would think they would be less Romanized. Like it's like those regions of frontier that, like even in Britain or even in north of Spain or in Armorica, that you said, well, or the Danubian area in general, where you see that yes, there was a Romanization, but the urbanization phenomenon, all the colonization wasn't so strong like, I don't know, in southern France, in southern Spain, etc. Here instead we find the Balkan hinterland. It wasn't so dramatically developed that you would think it was kind of more barbarically impregnable to Romanization in a sense, especially from a linguistical point of view. And instead it was not the case. Mesia, as we were saying before, was particularly wealthy. Was the only Danubian area that was concretely wealthy in practice, where there was more Romanization, and that's exactly where Aurelian, however, is told to have deported, resettled the Dacian population, the Romano-Dacians, right after the collapse. But Mesia, we know, also kind of declined quickly over time. So where did those people go? Well, we don't know. It might have gone to the north. Yes, and in that sense it would explain, perhaps more, that concentration of Romanity. Doesn't matter that there were Greek influences even in Mesia that are, that there was surely influences from lots of other populations. I mean, the same Romanian collects from many other peoples historically, etc., like any language. But maybe that bulk of Mesia might have maybe escaped, I don't know, Roman fiscal pressure, because we do find these things. You wouldn't have to think that a typically Roman, typical Roman peasant was so happy, especially in late antiquity, to be in the state that it was. It was overly burdened with fiscal pressure. It didn't enjoy much freedom. That area was very militarized, was frontier-like. Why not? It was impoverishing and kind of not really safe. So why not crossing from the other side in a way? I know that it sounds, let's say, because it sounds a bit against what actually the same people who lived from the other side did, because those who lived from the other side wanted actually to live within the Roman Empire, but they didn't want really to live into that frontier either. Right, look at what the Goths did. They at the end of the day, they wanted to go somewhere rich, like, I don't know, Gaul, Spain, Italy, right? And that's what they did. Instead, these other populations remained there in a way or another. It's possible that they crossed the north if they saw it as a way to, I don't know, instead of living in Mesia, it is all flat and open through the Danubian Valley to these continuous raids, invasions from the steppes peoples. Why not? Instead, then going further back into Roman land, going in the Carpathians and try to have a living there, right? In a more isolated, more tranquil area. That may be one of the answers. It's surely possible, though, that that there was still enough Roman speakers in Dacia, but this, however, goes too much against what Priscus basically says, right? Because it would have been, let's say, at least, and maybe the fact that it even states that there were people who knew how to speak Latin is a reminiscence of that. And if we interpret Priscus in that elitistic way that says, okay, these are barbarians because basically they speak now Hellenic or Gallic or whatever, but maybe the reality was there were lots of other people that spoke kind of a Roman tongue, and that they kept doing because they were in contact with the Romans. And this fact of the contacts is not to be underestimated, right? The epimexia, as he writes. Well, what contacts, right? Because we know that the Carpathians were under some periods where we're actually even started. We have made a video on the Japanese recently, for example, that shows how there was even a productivity locally, that there was a way to to export also. So the connections between the former Dacia and the Roman Empire surely continued, and we wouldn't be so even later on with the contact with the Byzantine Empire in general in those areas would go on. So the question is, it's definitely not an area that saw the disappearance of Romance speakers. And the best proof is what we see still today, in the face of the existence of such a large pool of Romance speakers in Romania. So, for now, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.